First of all, I want to demystify what it means to be an introvert. And I'm speaking to a lot of sort of young leaders, aspiring leaders and lawyers to help them lean into the strengths of introversion, even though they want to become lawyers. Because as a advocate, I have the opportunity to speak up. I have the opportunity to utilize my platform to speak to issues that are closely aligned to my mission and my values. But because I am an introvert, I've also found ways in which I can use written communication. So I write thought leadership pieces, I write op-eds. I am also exploring sort of longer length written material because that's also a way in which you can continue to make an impact and have your voice speak in different formats. So for me, being an introverted advocate is still being able to influence, communicate strategically and with clarity, and make a difference in the world.
Hello, welcome to episode 275 of the Quiet Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we will air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Dr. Shirah Mansaray is a solicitor advocate, managing partner of law firm Themis Crown Advocates, and founder of Purposeful Peak Performance Executive Coaching. Dr. Mansaray has over 20 years of experience across legal advisory, governance, and nonprofit leadership, and serves as a non-executive director at Amnesty International UK. She also serves on the International Advisory Board, Sabesia think tank. Her advisory work focuses on social justice, governance, and leadership, particularly in advancing ethical and inclusive decision making at the highest levels of organizations in the UK, Africa, and Europe. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Dr. Shira Mansaray. Shira, it's so
Thank
good
you.
to have you on today.
Thank you very much, David, for having me on.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into the work you do. First, of course, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to the work that you do.
Thank you. So my background is as both a lawyer and somebody who is passionate about advocating for equity and justice. So before becoming a lawyer, I was very much a student activist. I would fundraise for organizations such as Amnesty International and Save the Children. And when I had an opportunity to intern after my law degree, I was able to work at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And that's where I really found my passion to influence change both locally and internationally. After that, I worked as an advocate with the Financial Ombudsman Service. I then progressed into charity work where I started up an organization called I Am Somebody's Child Soldier. And the organization supports young children who are either former victims of war or were actively engaged in conflict. And through that organization, I led the mental health and education programs, as well as led the leadership team as the CEO. 10 years after, I decided I was going to go back into full-time legal advice, and now I'm a partner at Themis Crown Advocates and lead the charity and social enterprise team at the law firm.
Wow, you're doing a lot of great work.
Thank you, David.
And we are going to get it more into that. But first, of course, you're on the Quiet and Strong podcast and you're a fellow introvert. So when did you figure out that you were an introvert?
Great question. And David, before I go into how I figured out and when I figured out I was an introvert, I always make this anecdotal statement around introversion is oftentimes in my area of work looked at as a negative trait. And that is because, as a lawyer, an advocate, you do require instances of extroverted communication and that level of performance. So, what I grappled with earlier on in my career was performance extroversion, where I would have to project my voice and I'd have to speak up and really challenge myself as an introvert to be an extrovert. And because of the way in which I was looking to pursue my career objectives around becoming sort of a leader, a partner at a law firm, and having a wider scale of influence, I thought that I had to be an extrovert in order to get there. Fortunately, I had really great mentors who saw the toil it was taking on me in this performative extroversion that I was embroiled in. So earlier on, they managed to give me the grace and the space to lean into the strengths of introversion, which I'm sure we're probably going to talk about. But then I learned how to utilize my skills as a reflective thinker and somebody who enjoys written communication and strategic thought. So those are the tools that I have since then leaned on to develop my advocacy and my career. So, to your question around when I realized I was an introvert, I would say as early as or an early teenager when I was doing the campaigning work with Amnesty International and other organizations, because I would speak softly and quietly, even on the busy streets of London. And I still managed to get people to stop and sign up and engage with me. And I realized that actually I am somebody who prefers the dialogue and the communication one to one as opposed to large audiences and trying to garner communication impact with that. That's not to say that I don't speak on stages because I do do a lot of public speaking, but it's just understanding now that there are ways in which, as an introvert, self-declared introvert, I can still communicate to my strengths.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said because it's you have great strengths that you just articulated, and and that's the point of this show is we are learn your gifts, lean into them. You don't have to pretend to be an extrovert. You can be wildly successful as an introvert, but understanding your gifts. And, many great famous public speakers are introverts. They just learned how to do their preparation, how, sometimes manage your energy around that, things like that. So you don't have to pretend to be an extrovert. That's the whole point of the show. So well said on that.
Thank
So what's another strength that you have because you're an introvert?
In terms of strengths, the judgment, I believe from the approach that I take when I am either making a decision or a choice or ruminating on what's next. I have been able to understand the power of good judgment, and I lean into my intuitiveness and reflective nature before making a decision. I know sometimes leaders are required to make quick decisions and to be decisive, but I've also found it's not necessarily the speed at which you make an important decision, it's also the judgment that you bring. And as somebody who relies heavily on my inner wisdom and inner voice, I have built resources that I can lean into, whether that's because I read quite a significant amount of literature, books, thought leadership pieces. When it does come to making a decision, I'm able to take a step back, reflect on all that I've perhaps read in the past or at that moment, and then move from a position of strength.
Yeah. And, sometimes we make quick decisions, but sometimes our introvert gifts require some time. And
Yes.
we just need to learn to ask for that when needed and, not take all the time in the world, but come up with a reasonable deadline for ourselves to think. But sometimes
Yeah.
we make quick decisions, but sometimes we just need to say, give me a little bit of time to think about that.
Yes.
And Dr. Shear, on this podcast, we bust myths. What's an introvert myth you want to bust today?
Oh, great question. I'm going to speak to this from what I have heard others say it's not necessarily perhaps as widely understood, but I think people think introverts are shy. And I always tell people I'm not shy. If I do come across as shy, then that's perhaps something that the other person has observed from their own lens. But I don't think introverts are shy. I think we're good communicators. If anything, when we have the space to communicate, we are able to speak with clarity and articulate our thoughts. We speak at a pace that allows us to both think and reflect, and then speak with that level of reflection and insight, which doesn't necessarily speak to shyness. I do believe that because we sometimes are soft spoken or come to a group conversation with our own dynamic of first listening to others, sometimes people perceive our listening skills and our desire to listen intently as a node to shyness, which I don't believe is entirely true.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is they're shy extroverts. So it doesn't mean shy. Shy means that you're
Yeah.
lacking confidence in some way for some reason. There can be a lot of causes to it, but it's
Yes.
not synonymous with introversion. It just isn't.
Yeah.
And also why I do this show is I think that sometimes when someone doesn't understand their introversion, that can make them shy. But by
Mm,
understanding it as we're talking about, you can gain confidence. And there could be other causes as well.
yes.
And then what does it mean to you to be an introvert advocate?
Yes. And I call it a tagline, but also a very intentional branding strategy that I am now leaning into because first of all, I want to demystify what it means to be an introvert. And I'm speaking to a lot of sort of young leaders, aspiring leaders and lawyers to help them lean into the strengths of introversion even though they want to become lawyers. Because as a advocate, I have the opportunity to speak up. I have the opportunity to utilize my platform to speak to issues that are closely aligned to my mission and my values. But because I am an introvert, I've also found ways in which I can use written communication. So I write thought leadership pieces, I write op-eds. I am also exploring sort of longer length written material because that's also a way in which you can continue to make an impact and have your voice speak in different formats. So for me, being an introverted advocate is still being able to influence, communicate strategically and with clarity, and make a difference in the world.
Yeah, definitely. And also, you talk a lot about inclusive leadership. What is that? What makes a great leader and what is inclusive leadership?
When it comes to inclusive leadership, I'll speak to it from the point of what I aspire to achieve as an inclusive leader. And then I'll also speak to some of the challenges that are brought about because being an inclusive leader is not necessarily the norm, especially that, wherever there is power, there is tension. And wherever you are convening power, whether that's in a boardroom or in the C-suite, there are those tensions that come about because of the different personalities that end up holding power. So, to your point around inclusive leadership, I believe this is a way of leading where you bring people along the journey for the mission that you're striving to achieve. And the journey part is important because you understand that there are different ways that you can be inclusive. You can look to your culture. What culture are you building within that organization through your role as a leader? And understand how that culture could be inclusive, the different ways you could utilize collaborative models of working, the ways in which you can encourage recruiting diverse talent, the ways in which you allow those around you to ask questions, to constructively challenge you as a leader. I know sometimes leaders are against being challenged, but I firmly believe the way in which we grow as leaders is giving our team and our peers opportunities to constructively challenge us. However, the disclaimer there is respect. You know, when you are an inclusive leader or when you're aspiring to be an inclusive leader, sometimes you find barriers because the boundaries get crossed. And if you don't have the confidence and the strength in your own leadership style to reinforce those boundaries, then you end up down a slippery slope where people mistake your inclusive leadership as a weakness. So going back to your question around, what is inclusive leadership for me? It is to be able to create those spaces where people come along that journey with you to achieve the mission, but that journey needs to have embedded cultural change, embedded diversity as well, and language and communication and models for respect and boundaries need to be maintained at all points.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about perception of weakness, when it's not the traditional type of leadership people think they need to see. How can we change that? How can we change that perception? Like, this is, you know, the traditional leadership isn't necessarily the best.
In terms of changing, I believe when it comes to noticing that something isn't working, there's, you know, perhaps two paths one can take. One is in just recognizing that the style of leadership that you are on or that your organization has forced you as a leader to go down is not authentic to you. So that recognition piece, perhaps again speaking to my introversion and my reflective way of approaching problems is important because what you know you can change, what you don't know you cannot start to change. So the awareness and understanding where you are on that journey as a leader and where your organization is important as a first path or step. Second, it's about realizing what tools do you have within your organization or within your own leadership development program to start to articulate your leadership that is authentic to you. So you could utilize, there's different tools out there, whether it's to do with getting a coach or getting a mentor or getting a group of peers that support you to embed your leadership style that is inclusive and authentic. However, to your point around weakness, the stigma that is sometimes affiliated with inclusive leadership, depending on the organization or depending on the people in that leadership circle, either in boardrooms or C-suite, is just as important. Because if you are in a space that considers inclusive leadership or authentic leadership as a weak way of leading, for lack of better terminologies, then you can do one of two things: raise awareness that there are different ways that being an inclusive leader presents a positive and value add for the organization. So it does allow for constructive challenge. It does allow for people to feel that they are part of the organization and that hopefully would increase productivity of the staff because they feel that they are in a organization that is supportive and inclusive. And it also supports the board to manage risk and to have those strategic conversations in a way that aligns to the broader mission. So bringing it back for your listeners as well, when it comes to the weakness, anytime you are looking to lean into your own leadership philosophy or ethos, whether it's being an inclusive leader or a visionary or a strategic leader, always think about how you can build awareness of that leadership and how it adds value to your organization, but also those around you that can support you to continue on that journey to be an authentic leader.
Absolutely. And it's not always the loudest in the room that is the leader, right?
Yes.
And that's part of why I do this show is, I really do believe that there are many introverts that don't understand their gifts and they're not speaking up. They're not sharing their ideas as they should be. I know brilliant people that should be sharing their ideas better. So back to leaders, how can leaders ensure that, their teams are sharing their ideas and they feel comfortable that, there's a psychological safety there.
David, to your point of psychological safety, a couple of things. First of all, psychological safety should not be seen as just a soft approach to creating spaces where people are safe. There are also advantages for that organization, both from a strategic level, so psychologically safe boardrooms, C-suites, organizations do have added advantage of being able to articulate the risks for the organization because those individuals can then speak up. They can then feel confident enough to constructively challenge the senior leadership team or present their ideas and thoughts in a way that meets the expectations of the team. Now, for introverts, if you are somebody who prefers to write or to write your points, or if you have an idea, or if you've noticed that there is a risk emerging for the organization and you perhaps don't have that level of confidence to sit down with your manager or the senior leader to articulate that, then there are powerful tools that you could utilize, whether it's writing that down, whether it's having a session where you bring other people who are the evidence bearers who can speak to that risk. So I know different leaders who, when it comes to presenting a risk to the board, so if you're our CEO and you're presenting to your board of directors and you've noticed a risk, you would sometimes bring experts, whether that's an independent review or an independent report to substantiate what you've discovered as a risk. And those are ways in which you are bringing others on that journey with you, but at the same time, you're leaning into the power of additional evidence to support you as an introvert in communicating what you have a very clear and intuitive understanding of as a risk. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, how do introverts learn to advocate for themselves?
I believe we learn to advocate for ourselves through lived experience. So I'll take us back to when I had to quickly advocate for myself because I was in a room where there was a group of students. This is back when I was in U Uganda, and I was in a room. A group of students were making noise, and the teacher walks in with a cane and he's going to cane these students. And having come from the UK, I automatically knew this is wrong. You do not do this to children. But I was quite young. I must have been probably, 10, 11. So in that moment, I had a choice to make. I could either witness this injustice unfolding, or I could speak up and advocate for these children. And I spoke up. And in that time, that was the first time that the teacher had ever had a student speak to them like that. And bear in mind, as you can probably tell from the way that I'm speaking, I am not the loudest person in the room. So even the way in which I spoke up, if I recollect, it wasn't loud, it was just firm. And he walked away, he didn't cane the children. And for a period of time, I was the one that would speak up when I would see such injustices unfolding. So, to your point around speaking up and being able to utilize your voice, I sometimes believe that introverts are called to speak up, even when we feel scared or when we feel that our voice is not going to be heard. There is just this inner courage that comes through because you don't want to be that person that did not say something when you had the opportunity to.
Yeah, what a great story. You said you were 10 or 11?
Yes,
Wow. And I'm sure the other children appreciated your advocating for them.
thank you.
Yeah, amazing. And, and our teams are often going to be made up of introverts, extroverts, just naturally. How can leaders learn to support the different personality types?
I think with leaders, we first of all need to be able to notice who's in our team and find ways to support them so that they can also see for themselves who they are. So sometimes as leaders, you've got the pressure of fulfilling on, financial targets or cultural change. You've got different pressures that you're navigating, but the fundamental core pressure or core objective should be the well-being of your team, because that's when you have an organization that thrives. And for you to notice the well-being of your team, it is important to support those individual members to have a level of self-awareness and communicate that confidently with you. So, first of all, it is bringing those individuals either through one-to-one sessions where you have touch points with leaders. Now, not every organization can do this, obviously. Some organizations are very large, but even a leader who is, for example, a line manager, that's still a safe space where that individual team member can have a line of communication to somebody in a leadership position and build that relationship. The other point to your question is sponsorship opportunities. Now, as leaders, we can choose to be mentors to those within our line management or those who are aspiring to get to the stages that we are. But I believe individuals are heavily mentored and not as sponsored. Now, a sponsoring relationship is where if I am a leader, I would advocate for you in closed doors where you're not, because I know your skills, I know how good you are at delivering on your job, I know your values, I understand where your career objectives are. So I've had that chance to notice you as a team member, and we've had those one-to-ones where you've confided in me what your aspirations are. Now I can take that upon myself to help you advance in your career by speaking your name and your influence and impact in those closed doors, so that when the application process opens or when that opportunity arises, your name is already there to be considered. There are challenges to it, of course, because like I said, leaders have a lot of different pressures and tensions that they're grappling with, but I am actively encouraging more leaders to be sponsors within their organizations as well.
Yeah. And it's so important you said that, try to have that one-on-one because and that's often where we thrive as introverts is the one-on-one communication and try to have that where possible, definitely with our immediate team.
Yes.
So part of being an introvert is learning to manage energy, finding time to have that space to think and be reflective, as we've been talking about. Also, there's a time where you do need to recharge. How do you manage your energy as an introvert?
Really important question. And to that point around well-being, I'm hoping that your listeners are able to understand that when you look after yourself, then you can show up for the world, then you can show up for others. But if we are pouring from empty cups, that's when we get depleted, especially introverted advocates, because this is a very unique personality type where you feel that you want to be part of the solutions. You see the world problems, you see the challenges going on around you, whether it's community level or within your family or broader, and you always want to be part of the solution, which means you're always extending yourself. What I always say to myself is, okay, what can I do right now that's going to help me fill my cup? And I have different rituals. One, in the morning, I wake up early. I'm an early riser. I wake up so that I can have that quiet moment to either do some journaling. Meditation is very important to me, and praying as well, and just having time to ideate on what I want that day to look like, despite all the meetings and all the objectives that I need to fulfill on as a leader. I feel like that morning quiet is very important as a way to pour energy into my spirit and soul. And then the other thing I do during the day as well, I have check-in points where I can either do some breathing exercises, or I love to light a fire. Even in the summer, I would light a fire in my home if I'm working from home, or even just lighting a candle if I am in a space that allows for candles. So those are little rituals that just get me to be more present. Otherwise, before you know it, I'm up early, I work late sometimes, and just moments of reflection and well-being are what I aspire to.
Yeah, it's so important. I'm an early riser too, and the house is quiet if
Yeah.
I'm up before everybody else. And there's going to be people listening that aren't early risers, and that's fine, but you do need to find your space somewhere you know.
Mm.
It's so important, and it's to, do lots of different things. And sometimes the focus is, well, introverts need their recharge. Yes, absolutely. But we need some quiet for many other things as well. Just, to think, reflect, get some work done.
Yes, definitely. Even in the evenings for me, because I have most of my days intense from meetings, writing, public speaking, extroverted performance, as I say. So
Yeah.
when I have a moment to go quiet, that's me recharging. Even if it's, taking a walk. I love taking walks around London, watching a sunset. If I am out at the time when the sun is setting, I would intentionally find a moment to stop and appreciate the sunset. So that nature piece for me is important because it just triggers my inner voice to quiet and to get still, and that's how I recharge.
Yeah, it's so important to find those quiet times. And I think if anybody's been listening, they can tell you're a very busy person, but you need to find that space. You need
Yeah.
to find that space to, be reflective. And nature is also, that's the place I find that peace as well.
Yes, definitely. And I'll give you another example of how you can still create moments of quiet, and I call them pause moments because imagine, like I alluded to at the beginning of the podcast, I wear several hats. I'm a lawyer, I'm a partner at Themis Crown, I'm also the vice chair of Amnesty International's board. A mother of three young children, wife. So there's various hats, and I intentionally brought in my family life because there is this growing trend where women who are leaders are busy. But I also say, we also have a life, and the way in which we can create harmony between our ambitions and our work life is by also noticing our personal lives and how it is affected from the ambitions and the goals that we aspire to achieve as leaders. So by having pause moments that I could lean into by either spending a moment with in my personal life, finding a way to curate that social life is also just as important because essentially, the world is still going to move forward if something were to happen to me and my health. And all I will have is how do I rebuild my health? How do I come back to who I am if I have continuously poured out from an empty cup?
Yeah, that's some great advice there. Dr. Shearer, we've talked about lots of amazing things. Is there anything else you want to add today?
So I think to sum up, it is really important to be having this conversation in today's current climate where we have young people who perhaps have not had a chance to work in an office because of the rise in remote working styles, but also the unemployment rates, the ways in which young people are being led to believe there are different careers that they can take that are solely based online. So, to our audience, especially those that identify as introverts, it's important to find ways that you can still be part of your community. It's important to find ways where you can still socialize, have that one-to-one contact in person, in real life, and build those connections because now I'm putting on my hat as Dr. Shearer because my PhD looked at mental well-being and architecture and how we design our spaces to promote well-being. It's just as important to also intentionally build connections and having those moments where you're speaking to either, family members, friends, just coming outside of your house. We spend 90% of our time in a building. That's a lot of time that we're spending in a building. If we can find ways to spend that time with somebody to build those emotional connections and physical connections, that is how we start to address the rise in loneliness, depression, and other mental health, mental illnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks again for this great conversation. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing?
Thank you, David, for having me. So, for those that are listening, you can find me on LinkedIn, Dr. Shirah Z. Mansaray. I'm also on Instagram at introverted advocate, very fitting, and online from the law firm's website or anyone who's in person in London. I'll be more than happy to meet up and have a coffee if possible.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Shira.
You're very welcome. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.